moments of eternity of God.
Welcome back, everybody. My name is Conlon. I'm an author and contributor at The Prickly Pear. And today I want to talk about something else, something a little stupid that took over the news. It was the Elon-Trump Twitter feud. And I want to use it as a frame for understanding the phenomenon of the hoax. I'll just call it that. Mostly, I think the Twitter feud was a nothing burger, although I do think it was distasteful how Elon sounded like a dejected oligarch on Twitter. He seemed to be suggesting that Trump was somehow should be his political ward, or the administration should somehow be his asset because he purchased it. It was to me a very unsavory tone. He didn't state any of that explicitly, but to me he sounded like a dejected oligarch, and that is always a repulsive tone in a democratic republic. And it's also really repulsive for Elon to accuse, kind of in a sneaky way. He accused Trump of being a pedophile, essentially, and it's so immature and hyperbolic over a policy dispute. And additionally, it's sad and it's disgusting to see two friends turn on each other. And the only thing worse than seeing two friends turn on each other is seeing them do it publicly and inviting the rest of the world to think badly of one another. So there's all of that. It was not a nice episode, even though it was brief. But again, I do want to argue that this helps us understand in a much deeper way the phenomenon of the hoax, which has become so central to the Democrat Party and its attempt to maintain control. I don't think it would be too strong to say that the Biden administration governed through hoaxes. The biggest hoax being that Joseph Biden was the functional president, which he was not. I do think that the central event in this whole history of hoaxes, well, there are two. One is Donald Trump and just his rise into the realm of politics. And the second one is COVID. It's always good to remind oneself of how many hoaxes were launched by the entity or the coalition of institutions which control leftist power. You had, just to name a few, you had the Russian collusion hoax, which led to a federal investigation into the sitting president, undermining his legitimacy for almost more than half of his term, actually. You had the Very Fine People hoax. You had the mocking the disabled reporter hoax, where they said Trump was mocking a disabled reporter. You had the veterans are suckers and losers hoax. You had the Trump advised people to inject themselves with hoaxes. You had Trump banned Muslims. You had this hoax and that hoax. And there are some good sources that have documented the extensive list. The ones I just named do not exhaust the index here. The frame I'm putting on this is that these hoaxes can only be understood in light of COVID-19. And then I'll try to connect it to what went on with Elon and Trump. It's no secret that Trump is not just disliked. He's genuinely hated, and it's almost in a spiritual way. You know, people began ostracizing friends and family. He caused his critics increasingly to resort to or support or privately consider political violence as a legitimate form of resistance. We call it Trump derangement syndrome. But I think the way we have to understand this is throughout the Trump term, in the lead up to COVID-19, you had millions, tens of millions of Americans who were not only believing fake stories, designer falsehoods, hoaxes perpetrated, sanctioned by these official institutions, like the intelligence agencies peddling the Russian collusion hoax, members of Congress, the legacy media. You had tens of millions of people not just believing these, as I say, designer falsehoods, but actually getting an emotional dopamine hit off of believing them. And you have to understand this in light of addiction. Because the best way to get somebody addicted to something is to associate the action that you're trying to addict them to with a dopamine hit. That's social media in a nutshell. The people behind social media have gotten it down to a science. The reason why people scroll endlessly is because they get a dopamine hit every time they watch a short. And they become quickly addicted to it. So here's my claim. Whether it was on purpose or whether it was opportunistic predation, these Trump-related hoaxes, the Russia collusion hoax, the Very Fine People hoax, they gave Trump's haters a visceral and overwhelming emotional dopamine hit when they believed a fake story sanctioned or peddled by an official institution. If you had asked somebody, how are we going to pull off COVID-19? How are we going to shut down the world's economy? How are we going to confiscate the livelihoods of millions of people? How are we going to socially isolate entire populations? How are we going to shut down education? Here's what you'd have to do. You'd have to get people addicted to believing fake stories peddled by official institutions. That's it. That's my frame. You had millions of Americans who were addicted to believing falsehoods. And then the second part of that is the more that these Trump haters believed these stories, it wasn't just an emotional dopamine hit, but it was the ability to act on that hatred. So Donald Trump was Hitler. Donald Trump was a tyrant. Then, if you believe that, you take action. I'm not going to talk with my family members who supported him anymore. That's how serious I think resistance to Trump is. I'm going to ostracize my friends. I'm not going to speak out against political violence. So it wasn't just the emotional dopamine hit, it was the secondary moral pleasure that they took in believing these stories and then acting on their beliefs. The opportunity it afforded them to feel like heroes, like part of an underground resistance. Ostracizing friends, that's a hard decision, but I'm a good enough person to do that. Because we have to resist Hitlerism. It was the moral pleasure as well as the emotional dopamine hit. And that's exactly the two things you needed to pull off COVID. You needed people addicted to believing fake stories peddled by official institutions. And secondly, you needed people to take moral pleasure in acting on those beliefs. You needed people to think of themselves as better than if they followed official guidance, if they believed official stories. You didn't need to get everybody in the country to go along with the COVID-19. You just needed to create an environment of crushing peer pressure, widespread social shaming. And they did that through addicting millions of Americans to the act of taking moral pleasure in treating other people like shit as part of some supposed heroic resistance. The same people who believed that they were heroic for disinviting family members and breaking up friendships, those were the same people who believed they were morally heroic for screaming at you if you had your mask below your nose. And so I just want to leave you with the idea that the Elon-Trump affair, it's not a hoax in the literal sense of conjured falsehood, but it's a hoax in the way that it's meant to affect us. It's meant to be emotional dopamine for both Trump lovers and Trump haters. These tweets, aren't they hilarious? Ha, 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 ha. Think about all the memes and the Pride Month jokes and blah, 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 blah. Think about the uncontrollable urges to argue, to name call, to rhetorically vanquish my Twitter foes. Yeah, that's a hoax. That's the emotional dopamine. That's the moral masturbation. The left loves that. That's how they govern, through hoaxes. And it shows you that our society is really ill. And it's going to take a lot of moral discipline. It's going to take all of us to abstain in a way, to starve ourselves from social media events like that. Boycott them. And thank you very, very much for watching.